Magic Mirror. It was winter, as the snow fell from the sky. Sitting outside, the queen was busy knitting. As she continued working on, she noticed how the snow sparkled and caught the light. Then, one of the knitting needles pricked her finger, and a few drops of blood fell onto the snow. When the queen looked down onto the blood on the snow, she thought how she wished she had a child. She thought to herself that she would like it to be as fair as snow, lips red as the blood, and hair and eyes as black as ebony. Time passed, and the queen gave birth to a daughter. The daughter was very fair, had rose-like hips, had hair and eyes as dark as ebony. But soon after the queen gave birth, the queen died. The child was given the name of Snow White. A year after the queen died, the king took another wife. The new wife was very beautiful and very proud of it. She would not tolerate anyone that was more beautiful than her. Every day she would go and look in the mirror and ask it if she was the most beautiful of all. Every day the mirror would reply that she was so beautiful that no one could compare. This pleased the new queen, because she knew that the mirror could not lie, so what it said was the truth. Time went on, and as it did, Snow White grew up. Every day that Snow White grew, she became more and more beautiful. Once Snow White reached the age of 7, people began to talk about how beautiful she would be when she grew up. One day, the new queen was in front of the mirror and asked who was the most beautiful person. But this time, the mirror had a different reply. The mirror told the queen that Snow White will be 1,000 times more beautiful than her. Upon hearing this, the new queen was enraged. Every day the anger grew in the new queen's heart and mind, until one day she sent for a hunter. She told the hunter that she wanted him to get rid of Snow White and kill her. The new queen told the hunter that she wanted proof that Snow White was dead, and when it was done, she would pay him a great deal of money. The hunter went on his mission. He found Snow White and tricked her to come with him into the forest. Deep into the forest, the hunter pulled out his knife to stab Snow White in the heart. Snow White turned towards the hunter and looked into his eyes. She begged the hunter to let her live, and that she would go deeper into the forest, and promised she would never be seen again. The hunter could not kill her, so he let her go. Snow White thanked him and took off, out of sight. The hunter was sure that Snow White would not survive in the forest, but he was glad that he was not the one to kill her. In order to trick the new queen that he had killed Snow White, he killed a deer and took the heart. The hunter presented the deer's heart to the new queen and told her that Snow White was dead, and that this was her heart. The new queen was overjoyed that Snow White was dead. Snow White was terrified as she ran through the forest. Wild beasts would jump out at her, but once they saw her, they would not attack. Instead, they would let her pass. She ran until she could run no further. She stopped to look around, and that's when she found a small house. Seeking shelter, she went inside. It was very small, but very clean. The table was set for dinner, with 7 plates and 7 sets of silverware. At the wall there were 7 small beds, each covered with a small quilt. As she looked around, she found that nobody was home. She was so hungry and tired that she took some vegetables and bread, and then fell asleep on the bed. Darkness had fallen, and that's when the owners of the house came home. They were all dwarfs who were coming home from the mountains, where they were digging for gems and crystals. Once they were in the house, they went to turn on the light. They noticed right away that somebody had been in their house. They went to look at their beds, and that's when they found Snow White asleep. They all looked at each other, and they whispered at how beautiful a child she was. They were so delighted that they decided not to wake her. In the morning, Snow White woke up, and she was alarmed to see the doors in the house. They told her not to worry, and Snow White calmed down. The dwarves asked Snow White how she got there, and she told them. She told them about the new queen, about the hunter, and about how he let her go. After hearing all this, the dwarves went to talk to each other. They came up with a solution and came back to Snow White. They asked Snow White if she could consider being their housekeeper, to cook and clean and make clothes for them. Snow White told them that she could do that, and the dwarves told her that she could stay in the house and live with them, that no harm would come to her. Every day the dwarves would get ready to go to work, but each time before they left, they would turn to Snow White and tell her that she needed to be careful. The dwarves feared that while she was home alone, she would be in danger. They told Snow White that she should never let anyone into the house. The new queen, confident that she had Snow White killed, turned to her mirror and asked who was the most beautiful person. To her anger, the mirror told her that she was the most beautiful person in the city, but over in the mountains there was Snow White, who was 1,000 times more beautiful than her. The queen, enraged again, knew the mirror was telling the truth, and because of this, the hunter must have lied. The queen came up with a plan to dress as an old woman and whiten her hair. She went deep into the forest and found the dwarves' home up in the mountains. The new queen, disguised, knocked on the door. The queen was holding a basket of jewelry to sell. Snow White answered the door and asked the woman what she wanted. The disguised queen told her that she had the most beautiful jewelry to sell her. Snow White looked at the woman and thought to herself the woman looked very kind, so Snow White led her into the house. Snow White bought some jewelry and a silk corset. The disguised woman told Snow White that she would show her how to wear the corset. Snow White put the corset on, and the queen tied it up so fast and tight that Snow White could not breathe. Snow White fell to the ground, and the queen, assuming Snow White was dead, rushed out of the house and returned to her castle in the city. Not long after the queen left, the dwarves came back home to find Snow White on the floor, not breathing. The dwarves lifted Snow White out, and that's when they found the problem. Immediately they loosened the corset, and Snow White began to breathe a little. After some time passed, Snow White came to. Once Snow White was fully awake, she told the dwarves what had happened. The dwarves figured it out, and told Snow White that the old woman was actually her stepmother, the new queen. Once the new queen was home in her castle, she went to her mirror. The new queen asked the mirror if she was the most beautiful woman. The mirror replied that she was the most beautiful in the city, but Snow White in the mountains was 1,000 times more beautiful than her. The new queen, hearing this, was so terrified and angry that Snow White was still alive, made up her mind that she would kill Snow White again. The queen had some magic skills, and she used them to make a magic poisoned comb. Whoever brushed their hair with this comb would die. Armed with this comb, the new queen made a new disguise and went back out into the forest and into the mountains. It wasn't long before she found the house of the dwarves. The disguised queen, walking around the house, started to call out that she had goods to sell. Snow White told her to go away. Then the queen told her that she could have the comb for free if she liked. Snow White could not resist, so she let the disguised queen in, and the queen began to comb Snow White's hair. As soon as the comb touched Snow White's head, she fell down to the ground, with the comb still in her hair. The disguised queen laughed, and jumped up and left the house, making it all the way back into the city and into her castle. The dwarves came back home, and that's when they found Snow White on the ground. They pulled the poison comb out of Snow White's hair, and slowly she came back to life. Again Snow White told the dwarves what had happened, and again the dwarves told Snow White that the woman was the queen in disguise. that she should never let anyone into the house while she's alone. Once the new queen was back in her castle, she went up to her room and turned to her mirror. Again, she asked who was the most beautiful person, and again the mirror replied that she was the most beautiful person in the city, but out in the mountains, Snow White was still 1,000 times more beautiful than her. The new queen began to shake with rage and fury. The new queen made a vow that she would be the one to kill Snow White, even if it killed her in the process. With a new plan, the queen dressed in a different disguise. This time she took an apple and poisoned it. This was no ordinary apple. This was the most beautiful, most enticing apple ever. It would be difficult for anyone to resist eating it. So armed with this apple, the new queen left the castle and went into the forest and made her way into the mountain. The disguised queen found the dwarf's home and knocked on the door. Snow White yelled through the window that she would not let the woman in, and told her that it was because the dwarf said she could not trust anyone. The disguised queen told Snow White that she was here to sell apples, and that she could try one for free. Snow White was still suspicious. The disguised queen knew this, and showed her the poisoned apple, and pretended to take a bite out of it. Snow White, now trusting the disguised queen, accepted this sample poisoned apple, and took a bite out of it. Snow White's face turned to horror, and then she fell on the ground, dead. The queen, laughing, returned to her castle, ran to her room, then turned to the mirror and asked it who was the most beautiful person of all. The mirror replied that the new queen was the most beautiful person, and that there was no one as beautiful as her. Finally, the new queen could rest easy. The dwarves soon returned to their home, and that's when they found Snow White on the ground. They knew this time that Snow White was dead for sure, because she was not breathing and showed no signs of life. They tried everything they knew to bring her back to life, but nothing worked. The dwarves laid her on the table and cried and mourned for days. On the third day of mourning, they noticed that Snow White's appearance had not changed, so they decided that they would not bury such a beautiful person in the ground. They decided to make a coffin made out of glass, and it would sit at the side of the mountain. They created a letter saying here was a daughter of a king. All the birds and beasts came out and mourned the death of Snow White, and as time went on, her appearance still did not change, until one day a prince of a king was riding through the forest by the mountain. The prince found Snow White's coffin with transparent glass. He read the letter, then went to the dwarfs. The prince told the dwarfs that if they let him have the coffin with Snow White, that he would give them whatever they asked for. The dwarves replied that they would not give the prince Snow White for all the gold in the world. Then the prince replied, asking instead to have Snow White as a gift. He would have her honored in his home. The prince also went on to say that he had a feeling as though he had been drawn to Snow White. The dwarfs talked it over, and they decided that they would give Snow White to the prince. With that, the prince left the dwarfs. The prince returned to Snow White with a crew to carry the coffin back to his castle. As they went to lift the coffin, a piece of the poisoned apple that was still in Snow White's mouth fell out. As soon as it did, Snow White woke up and sat up, now alive. Snow White asked where she was, and the prince, overjoyed, told her the whole story. Snow White went with the prince, and when they returned to his home, the king was so happy for his son and Snow White that he told her she was safe with them. The prince and Snow White decided to get married. There was to be a large feast to celebrate the marriage of the prince and Snow White, and it happened that the stepmother, the new queen, was invited. The new queen was excited for the party and turned to her mirror and asked who was the most beautiful person of all. This time, the mirror told the queen that she was the most beautiful in her city, but the bride would be 1,000 times more beautiful than her. Angry, the new queen went to the feast, and upon seeing that the bride was Snow White, and how beautiful she now looked as an adult, was enraged. The new queen danced as she tried to figure out how to kill Snow White. The new queen danced all night, not figuring out a way to kill Snow White, until all of a sudden the new queen dropped dead from dancing too long.